Our study of Greek sculpture will begin with the geometric and archaic periods. The search for the Greek ideals and values is nowhere more evident than in their spirited study of the human body. The human body was the form in nature considered by the Greeks to be of the highest order. The finest Greek art will seek to discover the ideal human figure, as opposed to simply recording a human figure from a naturalistic standpoint. To give you an idea of where we're going to go, think back to the development of the figure in the vase paintings that we've just looked at. How did the images of man evolve from the geometric period to later red figure and white ground vases? It evolved from abstraction to naturalism. This is a logical order that we've seen before and will see again. Had the Greeks continued as a culture of power, perhaps they would have come full circle, witnessed 20th century developments, or delved into painting as a new challenge. This is a piece called Calvary Frieze from Temple A from the late 7th century BC. It's limestone and it's 32 3/4 inches high. Now, while the Greeks will become famous for their sculpture, it's fairly safe to say that they were not born sculptors. Witness the problems in this 7th century frieze from Crete. While it's an effective design solution for the space, two huge problems exist here. First off is proportion. Look at the legs to the bodies of the horses. And secondly, the scale is rather peculiar in that the riders appear to be tiny by comparison to the horses. So again, the Greeks are not just born sculptors. This is a piece called Hero and Centaur, or Heracles and Nessos, from around 750 to 730 BC. It's bronze, about 4.5 inches high. And I want you to look at one more similar piece. This is called Warrior from Olympia, from the 8th to 7th century BC. A bronze sculpture that's about 8.5 inches high. Now, these two slides of 8th century warriors are highly primitive, and they're essentially symbol-oriented representations. The Greek ideals are going to force the Greek artist into a long search for the unity of the ideal human figure with the skills needed for naturalistic depiction of observed phenomena. This is called Cleobus and Biton, from the Sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, dating from around 615 to 600 BC. They're made of island marble, and each is 84 inches tall, exactly 7 feet. Now, these two Greek kouros figures, a kouros is a boy, represent a significant step forward from the earlier warrior figures that we've looked at. First off, they're better proportioned than those small bronze figures. Secondly, while they're stiff and formal, attempts were being made to understand the mass of the figure. Now, this may be explained as figures like these sometimes served a column-like purpose. A third and very important issue is that the figures themselves are striding. The Greeks are already coming to grips with the notion of motion, and this will really separate their art from that of the Egyptians. These also are the earliest large sculptures by the Greeks in white marble, something they'll become very well known for. The sculptor here is concerned with details of the figure that are rendered in carved flat planes, and the essentials of the human shape are emphasized and used to create expressive patterns. This is evidence of the Greek artist not quite letting go of previous abstract concerns, at least not yet. Nevertheless, Cleobis and Biton are significant moves forward toward naturalism. This is a standing youth, or Kouros figure, from right around 600 BC. He's made of marble. He's 6 foot 1.5 inches tall. Now this Kouros continues the pattern set down in the twins that we just looked at, who had a great sort of abstract treatment to the torso. Yet here the figure begins to seem more natural through 3 different aspects. First off, there's a further articulation of details, especially in those stomach muscles. Secondly, you'll notice that compared to the previous slide, this figure is much more slender. And third, there is a greater appreciation for form versus symbol. However, there are some areas of this sculpture that are still symbol-oriented. Note the eye sockets. They're very symbol-oriented. The hair as well. So they're still struggling a little bit with letting go of abstraction, but it's getting much, much more natural. This is called Kroisos, or a Kouros from Anavaisos, dating from 525 BC. It's marble, 6 foot 4 inches tall. Now, over the next 50 to 75 years, continued improvements were made. Now, this is an unusual area in that we can actually look at art in terms of linear improvement or linear development. The figure here is truly at the doorstep of arriving at the natural body portrait that's referred to by Gardner. Abstract pattern is now all but completely eliminated. This, in a sense, is the palette of Narmer for the Greeks, and it sets the stage for most Greek sculpture to follow. Now, 2 aspects of the sculpture are still lacking somewhat. First off, the pose of the figure is still somewhat stiff and formal. And secondly, what part is the most abstract? The head. Greek sculpture is unusual in that the Greeks avoided individual characteristics in their sculpture, yet valued it so highly as part of their culture. This is Kritios boy, or standing youth, from around 480 BC, marble, 46 inches tall. What is the major difference between this Kritios boy and the previous sculpture? It's an understanding of the human figure's constant gesture. Movement and motion are always implied, even in a standing figure. The artists responsible for these works were remarkably observant, and these are tremendous accomplishments of the Greeks. This is a sphinx from a grave stele dating from around 540 to 530 BC. Truly, the Greeks were at their best when observing nature. Looking back at our chronology, we see that between the geometric and archaic periods, there was an orientalizing period, where images such as this sphinx were introduced. How does this work compared to the Egyptian models. It's pretty poor, almost a ridiculous combination of elements. No effort was really given to endowing this creature with any semblance of grace. Here's another Sphinx from around 540 to 530 BC, and this one with that facial expression seems almost more ridiculous than the previous slide, if that's possible. And one last additional Sphinx from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I believe. Thankfully, these Sphinxes were not enduring works with respect to future influence. Now, so far, the Greek sculpture that we've seen is solely that of man. While man or boy was almost always represented nude, the women in their sculptures are usually clothed. As a matter of fact, the Olympic Games were originally held, or very early on held, in the nude. Now, this clothing of kore figures is possibly in reference to the attitude of a woman's place being in the home, which is not always but often representative of the Greek attitude. While the Greeks were a remarkably open society, love among men was not a scarlet letter in their day, the Greeks could be incredibly close-minded about other matters. This figure is called Hera from Samos, dates from around 570 to 560 BC. She's marble, 5 feet 6 inches tall. Now, this statue dedicated to Hera shows up an Assyrian influence in Greek sculpture. The statue, like Assyrian sculpture, uses the very form of the marble as an integral part of the composition. The simple incising to indicate drapery should be acknowledged. From this simple and humble start will come a tour de force of Greek sculpture. This is the Kore in Dorian Peplos, around 530 BC. This figure's marble, stands 48 inches tall. Now, the Peplos Kore shows, or doesn't show, if you will, another break from the stylistic conventions of other cultures, notably the Egyptians. The missing arm was extended, something not seen in Egypt. This piece may have served a prayer function, like the big-eyed folks we saw from Tel Es-Mar. This last Kore figure, and the previous one, shows how paint was used to accent many of the marble sculptures done at this time. The Greeks used the encaustic technique to apply paint to the most important details of their sculpture. The encaustic technique is one where you mix pigment with beeswax, and you have to heat the wax up to mix the pigment with it. You end up with cakes of color as opposed to tubes of paint. And then in order to paint, you literally use a hot plate as your palette, and you heat the paint back up, and then you apply the paint to whatever surface it is that you're working on. The disadvantage to encaustic paint is that it dries remarkably fast. In fact, if you're working away from the heat, by the time you complete a very short brush stroke, it's dry. So this encaustic technique was used to paint their sculptures. A great benefit of the encaustic technique is that it's very durable because it's impervious to water. So that's why we can still see some paint on some of these sculptures. It also, because it's wax, has a very beautiful translucent quality to it, and you can get rich color that appears to be very thickly painted with just a very few thin glazes. Encaustic comes from the Greek term enkaustikos, which means to burn in. Now we have now seen the foundation for the greatest Greek sculpture laid down in the Archaic period. We go now to sculpture from the early classical or transitional period. Sculpture of this period is also referred to as being of the severe style. It differs from archaic sculpture in two basic ways. First off, it was based on an understanding of the human body as it really is or was, and it was not merely a collection of features. For this reason, the Critios boy is often placed in this stylistic designation. The effect of uneven distribution of weight is further studied with respect to various limbs and on clothing. And secondly, the figures are not always in action, but they are generally expressive, and we're left to discern their concerns through their gestures and implied attitudes. Many of the sculpture from this time period, many of the sculptures shout arrogance, and this is an expression that was characteristic of the severe style. What we're looking at here is a sculpture of Zeus, dating from around 460 to 450 BC. He's bronze, stands 6 feet 10 inches tall. Now this bronze is a great example of the severe style. Some textbooks identify this figure as Poseidon rather than Zeus. The answer lies in whether he is about to cast a thunderbolt or a trident. And depending on the textbook that you consult, you're going to see it referred to as Zeus or Poseidon. The action here alone distinguishes this work from the Archaic period. It's thought that this represents a god striking at the Persians. Now, how is their god represented? Majestic, but not divine. He's very human indeed. Now, compositionally, while this work is in 3D, it is largely successful from only the frontal torso view that we see here. So perhaps remnants of Egyptian thought are still hanging on for dear life. Another possibility is that the sculptor that created this work was an artist whose chief occupation was that of producing relief work for the major architectural structures of the day. This is the charioteer from the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. Dates from around 470 BC. It's bronze, 71 inches tall. The charioteer was originally part of a larger grouping, and he seems very different from Zeus or Poseidon. We get a feeling for a sculptor still trying to get comfortable with the new style. Remnants of the old method still exist here. The legs are stiff, and the folds in the drapery, which was the usual mode of dress for charioteers, are almost too regular and too perfect. And secondly, the hair was handled as merely a decorative device of no great plasticity. Nevertheless, his action, expression, and contrast this with archaic faces if you doubt that it's expressive, and elements of extremely close study make this an exceptional work. Pay particular attention to the hands and the feet. A subtle twist in the figure that's not evident in frontal views further strengthens the work. And the effect of weight on the folds, particularly in the upper torso, is beginning to be considered in the charioteer. This is Discobolos, or the discus thrower. This is a Roman marble copy after a bronze original by the artist Myron. It's life-size, and it was done around 450 BC. Now, this work by Myron was not designed strictly as a work of art, but it was designed to commemorate an athletic victory. The features here are emotionless, not an individual portrait like those of Egypt. It is, however, magnificent in its range of movement. Like the statue of Zeus, however, Discobolos was made to be seen largely from one angle. Also, this sculpture, like many others, is known only through faithful copies in marble done by the Romans. The bronze originals were often melted down to make weapons and other items. Can you imagine taking a terrific bronze sculpture such as this and deciding that you have a greater need for cannonballs? We're going to look now at sculpture from the High Classical period. This is also called the Mature period. Here we have Doryphoros, the spear bearer, again a Roman copy after an original of around 450 to 440 BC by Polykleitos. This is marble and stands 6.5 feet tall. Now here we have a work of the Mature Classical period of great importance. The master Polykleitos made the original in bronze. Again, this is a Roman marble copy. Polykleitos was so famed that his name and the term sculptor were used interchangeably by Aristotle. Now, three major points can be made about this work. First, the weight of the body is entirely on one leg, giving the effect of walking. Secondly, it's an outstanding rhythmical composition with contrasting tension and relaxation in the arms and legs. Still, this sculpture is made largely to be seen from the front. Nearly 100 more years will pass before attempts at spiral composition take place. And most importantly, third, for the future, the statue was based on a meticulous system of proportions. Remember, the Greeks are interested in the ideal, to make man in general godlike. Polykleitos wrote a book explaining the statue. Both the book and the statue were called the Canon, with one N. And in this case, canon means measuring rod. His theory of beauty and interest in its propagation were probably behind his motives for the book. Now we're going to look at late classical period sculpture. In this period, which begins with the Peloponnesian War, idealism was in a sense lost, and this is the natural result of a war between city-states or within a country or geographical area. The Greeks will come to focus even more on the individual and come to represent man in by far the most naturalistic sense yet. Absolute beauty cries out in the late classical period. In many cases, stylistic refinements were added to an already impressive resume in dealing with the figure. This sculpture is Hermes, a Roman copy after an original of around 320 to 310 by Praxiteles, marble, 7 feet tall. Now, this work, originally by Praxiteles, is a much more relaxed interpretation of the figure. No longer are we to be merely impressed by the grandeur and importance of the figure being depicted. Possibly, this is done in order for the artist to call attention to himself. Now, Praxiteles' concept of beauty is seen even 250 years later in this Hellenistic Aphrodite. This is Aphrodite, Eros, and Pan from Delos, dating from around 100 BC. It's marble and a little under 4.5 feet tall. This is Mausolus from the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. Dates from around 360 BC. He's marble, 9 feet 10 inches tall. Now, how does this slide differ from the preceding sculptures of man that we've seen? Well, he's clothed, for one thing. Articles of drapery appear to be a great concern to this artist. And secondly, he seems much more individualized, and this is thought to be a portrait. Now, in some ways, this sculpture signals the coming end of idealization in sculpture. Where else is there to go once perfection is realized? This is a piece called Apoxiomenos, or Scraper. It's a Roman marble copy, probably after a bronze original by Lysippus from 330 BC, 6 foot 9 inches tall. Now, one more innovation or hurdle remained to be conquered by the Greeks. What was that? That of the figure moving in space, a true 3D treatment of the figure. Lysippus, or Lysippos here, gives us a figure which works from more than one angle. Lysippos was famous not only for being the court sculptor to Alexander the Great, but for slenderizing the figure and essentially introducing a new canon of proportions. Remember, laws and rules were important to the Greeks. They have an almost backwards philosophy, and it's from rules comes freedom. This is a bronze statue of a youth, Paris, found in the Sea of Antikythera from around 350 to 330 BC. This figure is called Antikythera Youth often, and this gives an indication of both idealizing and naturalizing. Which elements seem to go which way? The old or the ideal attitude is seen in the massive physique and the forward-walking stance. And the new and natural attitudes are seen in somewhat slender proportions and the sweeping reach of the hand. Action is implied here, and that action will show up more in the last phase of Greek art, the Hellenistic period. Still not handled naturally is the hair. I guess it's comforting for us to know that the Greeks even had their problems, especially with hair, which seems to be a problem for a number of students. Other materials were often used for the eyes, etc. in their sculptures. This is the head of a boxer from Olympia, late 4th century BC. It's bronze, about 11.5 inches tall. Now, to make clear the distinction between late classical and Hellenistic work, consider this slide. More portrait-like? Definitely, as it's a portrait of a pugilist. While this portrait works quite well, other portraits of the period don't convey personality traits quite as forcefully. Greeks of this time are still having trouble overcoming their idealizations of the human figure. In fact, you could argue that they never quite shake it. It does look like this fellow has perhaps had his nose broken a time or two. We're going to look now at sculpture from the Hellenistic period, And Hellenistic sculpture can be seen as addressing 4 different concepts. Quite simply, they are the following. 1. Spiral composition concerns. 2. The continued importance of beauty. 3. They look for new subjects, even to the point of becoming trivial. And 4. The sculptures generally are more expressive. This is the Nike of Samothrace. Dates from around 200 to 190 BC. It's marble, 8 feet tall. The spiral composition and spatial concerns are immediately evident in the Nike of Samothrace, which is also referred to as Winged Victory. The sculpture is dazzling in a number of ways. First off, the spatial and implied movement is tremendous. Second, this thing is remarkable in its illusions. That of marble implying windswept drapery. Can you make a rock imply the characteristics of a feather? Well, that's what the artist did here. And another illusion that I find just absolutely stunning in this piece is that of transparency. You see the drapery over the stomach, and you see the belly button kind of peeking through. So he's made the marble look like transparent drapery over flesh. A remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. And third, last, and certainly not less important, is the fact that this sculpture, when seen from different angles, works all the way around. This is a big accomplishment that at this point in time was becoming second nature to Greek sculptors. This is the Dying Trumpeter by Epigonos of Pergamon, a Roman copy after a bronze original of around 230 to 220 BC, marble, life-size. This dying trumpeter or dying Gaul is an arresting image for several reasons. It's expressive of pain and suffering. It's narrative in that it's descriptive of a happening. And it's spatial. It continued to place more importance on the space or the stage in this example. This is the Laocoon group, perhaps by Agasander, Athenodoros, and Polydoros of Rhodes, 1st century BC, marble, 7 feet tall. The Laocoon group from around the time of Christ continues the spiral sense of composition. The action and theme are that of suffering, perhaps a parallel to the situations the Greeks found themselves in. Now, what's unusual about this image? The interweaving of the figures with the serpent, for one, and secondly, very unusual, are the shifts in scale. And perhaps this is signaling a move from naturalism toward abstraction, giving some thought to making sure that the viewer gets the point. If you are in need of an extra credit assignment and want to do a report on the Laocoon group and the story behind this image, send that to me via email. This is the Venus de Milo by Alexandros from around 150 to 125 BC. Marble, about 6 feet 7 inches tall. Now, this famed work, also called the Aphrodite from Melos, gives reason for celebration in the midst of the coming end of Greek art as a moving and vital force. The age-old concept of ideal beauty had never been handled better. However, the desperation of the artist is signaled and that he is obviously stepping backwards in search of ideas, in contrast to the always forward-moving nature of Greek art, both literally and figuratively. Nonetheless, this is an impressive work of art. When you look at it, you might ask the question, is that marble or is that skin? Now, this is Sleeping Eros from Rhodes, around 150 to 100 BC, bronze, 33.5 inches long. And I think desperation on the part of the Greek artists is further evidenced by just plain silly motifs, such as the Sleeping Eros, or there's even one called Boy Strangling a Goose. You are truly desperate if that's the theme for your work of art. This is a jockey from around 240 to 200 BC. When cute becomes an overriding response to a work of art, it may be that it has outlived its usefulness. Both the Sleeping Eros and the jockey are cute representations of what appear to be children. Rather than advancing sculptural ideals and ideas, artists were now merely looking around for something different to depict. While not a bad thing by necessity, it's certainly a far cry from what started this, the thirst for knowledge by the Greeks. This is a seated boxer from Rome, from around 100 to 50 BC, bronze, just a little over 4 feet tall. Do you feel like this after looking at all this sculpture? So do I. This seated boxer is representative of Greek art at this point in history. Proud, but now battered. Its time of leading the art world is now over, but it would still lead by example and influence.